Have a seat. Welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed breakfast. It is now my pleasure to introduce Anne Griffin, who will help welcome our speakers. Anne is founder and managing partner of Aragon Global Management, an investment fund focused on global equities. She is also co-founder of the Griffin Foundation. A native of France, Anne is a graduate of the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and Harvard Business School. She is a longtime supporter of philanthropy in Chicago and is actively involved with civic affairs nationally. Please help welcome Anne Griffin.
Thank you, John. Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce my friends Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen of Google. Eric Schmidt is executive chairman of Google. He is considered one of the most influential architects of the internet, having helped grow Google from a Silicon Valley startup to a global technology powerhouse. Eric launched his career as a software engineer. He was chief technology officer at Sun Microsystems, CEO of Novell, and also previously served on the research team at Xerox PARC, Bell Labs, and others. Eric went on to serve as chief executive officer of Google for 10 years, from 2001 to 2011, overseeing the company's technical and business strategy. Under his leadership, Google dramatically scaled its infrastructure and diversified its product offering, while at the same time maintaining a strong culture of innovation. Eric wears many hats, one of which is ambassador at large for the internet around the world. He's been instrumental in navigating and shaping the mosaic of regulatory frameworks around digital in many countries. He's a fierce defender of the open internet, having recently traveled to Rangoon and Pyongyang. He has many tales to tell us from those trips. And did I mention that he is a pilot, so when he tells you he's flying to Pyongyang, he actually means it literally. Eric has been involved in many civic endeavors. He chairs the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., and is a close advisor of President Obama on technology issues. He's also been a frequent visitor to Chicago, especially in 2012, when he, and I see his team and associates are here with us, when Eric had a big hand in recruiting some of the best tech brains behind the re-election campaign's use of big data. So he knows Chicago well. Thank you for being here today, Eric. Jared Cohen is founder and director of Google Ideas, Google's in-house think tank, which explores how technology can be applied to political and geopolitical issues. Previously, Jared served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff. He was not only the youngest member in history to do so, but after his service under Condoleezza Rice, he was one of the few that was asked to stay on as an advisor to Hillary Clinton. Jared is a bit of a travel daredevil, and if it's a war zone, a pariah state, or a disaster area, he's always up for the trip. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, any place dangerous in Africa. He's told me about interviewing pirates and al-Shabaab Mujahideen terrorists in Somalia. And if that wasn't enough, the talks took place in a prison cell while the prisoners played Sudoku. He is the author of the book Children of the Jihad, which explores the intersection of youth culture, geopolitics, and technology, and has also written a book called 100 Days of Silence about the Rwandan genocide in American foreign policy. Despite his young age, he was recently named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. The conversation between Eric and Jared will be moderated by J.B. Pritzker. As many of you know, J.B. is an active entrepreneur, an investor, a philanthropist. He knows a thing or two about technology himself, having founded New World Ventures in 1996, which is today the leading venture capital firm in the Midwest. He's had a great eye for tech investments, too, having bet early on companies like Facebook, Active Networks, and many others. But JB's also been a great role model for entrepreneurs in Chicago. He's fostered many digital initiatives in the tech and venture centers here. He founded 1871 and chairs Chicago Next, the Mayor's Council on Innovation and Technology. Thank you, JB. We look forward to an engaging discussion. Please help welcome Eric, Jared, and JB.
Thank you, Anne. right, presumably my mic was not on when I went to the restroom a little earlier. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here. I'm so thrilled, frankly, for not only to be up here with you, but also to have you here in Chicago. I had the great good fortune to read your new book, and I must say it is compelling and challenging all at the same time. And when I picked it up, I admit that I thought I was going to peer into a viewfinder of Google Glass and immediately see, the future clearly. But you write about a lot of things that seem to have their roots in war-torn areas of the world and in closed societies. And I know that it was said, of course, that you've spent a lot of time, Jared, in Afghanistan and Baghdad, and you too, Eric. You've traveled North Korea and Baghdad, and I think you two met in Baghdad. Tell us about those travels and frankly, what it is that led you to write the book together.
Well, let me start by saying that it is great to be back at the Economic Club. I think this is my third appearance here over the last decade. And I've come to really love Chicago. I spent almost 2 years here working with my friends in the campaign, and we have a huge operation here at Google. There's a lot of reasons to love Chicago, which is, I think, why you're all here. And thank you very much for having us. I think for both of us, when we started a couple of years ago, we weren't quite sure what the goal was, and what we came to was a sense that the world is about to change in a really profound way because of the advent of mobile connectivity. That what will happen in the next 5 to 7 years is another 5 billion people will join the internet almost exclusively through mobile devices. When that happens, and we take it for granted here, right? Go watch an old movie, a 25-year-old movie, and remember what your life was like before texting, mobile phones, tablets. It seems like a much simpler life, I might add. So imagine now you're a poor person in a village with no running water, no bathrooms, etc., no television or anything, and a mobile phone arrives. It's life-changing because in this one device you have all the world's information, all the world's languages. It's your device for entertainment, for knowledge, for medicine. This, in many ways, is a very, very good thing.
And to add to what Eric mentioned, when you think about the next 5 billion people who are coming online, these people are coming online in parts of the world where you have conflict, violence, instability, and where the governance model is either autocratic or extremely dictatorial. So Eric and I traveled to 30-plus countries together, places like Libya and Tunisia, Afghanistan, North Korea, to try to meet some of these future users. Because these next 5 billion are actually going to constitute the vast majority of people who use our tools. We wanted to understand whether they're connected today or not, what types of challenges are they encountering. How are they thinking about the challenge of terrorism? How are they thinking about the challenge of violence in their particular society? And then how are they going to stand up to some of the most autocratic and totalitarian societies left on Earth? Again, places like North Korea.
So you talk about, in the book, the potential for continuing revolution as a result of the use of technology. Can you talk about that and also, the Arab Spring?
Well, the argument we make in the book is we know the story of Arab Spring, right, which is lots of people pouring into the streets against a particular regime. The argument that we make, however, is that in the future, revolutions will be easier to start, but that they're going to be harder to finish. And they're going to be harder to finish for a couple reasons, which is, one, while technology gets people into the streets around a common theme of get a bad dictator out of power, we'll sort of table all the sectarian and ethnic and socioeconomic issues for afterwards. What you realize is once the dictator is gone, whether it's Ben Ali, Saleh, Gaddafi, or Mubarak, technology can't replace the need for real leaders, and technology can't replace the need for real institutions. And so ultimately, it can get people into the streets, but without both of those other things, you can't actually complete a revolution.
What was interesting is in going to Egypt and talking to that, and you were actually in Egypt during the revolution, typical, Jared. What happened was that there was a point at which Mubarak shuts off the internet. Now, in the dictator's handbook, it says when the crowds are running in the streets, turn off the internet. This instruction is incorrect. Because what happens is there's this very large middle class of people who are busy on the internet, and the dictator has just shut it down. And they go, crap, right? I need to be on the internet, and they become your opponents.
Well, and of course, Eric, you and I have talked
And by the way, I'm not making this up. So in fact, after 4.5 days, they were forced to turn the internet back on.
Well, they made the mistake of following the Iran example, which did this in 2009. I remember being in Tahrir Square the day of the revolution, and you would ask all these young people why they went to the streets, and you would assume it's because they had some deep-seated hatred for Mubarak and some revolutionary spirit deep in their blood. And they said, I never cared about politics much, but then Mubarak shut off the internet, and he really pissed me off.
So by the way, this
typical young people, right?
Typical young people. And by the way, the Syrian government, after almost 2 years of violence, has just shut down the internet. So things must be really, really serious in Syria.
So what about the closed societies where, North Korea just seems like a veil, I think, to most people. And it must be that people are not walking around with devices. And what must that be like? What is it like?
We went to North Korea because, firstly, it was his idea. And so the idea was, let's go visit countries that are just beginning. We forget what we came from. And North Korea is the least disconnected, the most disconnected country in the world. It's the most closed. And so we land, of course, the way you get to North Korea is that you fly in from Beijing on Air Koryo, which is the world's least safe and lowest rated airline in the world. And you can imagine what that's like. Curiously, in a brand new 767, which is a brand new Aeroflot airplane, which is sort of bizarre. And the country is very, very, very poor, but has some legacy of its rich past. So the buildings are very pretty, but there's no heat because there's no power. So you're frigid. And there are about 1 million phones in North Korea, and those phones are perfectly capable of doing all the things that our phones do, but the government won't turn on the data roaming. So there's essentially no internet connectivity. So they force us to give our devices at the border, which is a very strange feeling, right? So Jared and I, my daughter, 5 others, were all on the plane, and all of a sudden we're together traveling without the internet. And we get to know each other, and we become best friends. Shocking! 3 days with 7 other people I actually liked.
Well, of course, I predicted that after 2 days, Eric's thumbs would start twitching, which did not happen. It turned out he became very sociable and wanted to talk a lot. Of course, there was no food in the country, so I bought a bunch of snacks at the airport in Beijing, which Eric came and stole every morning. It's very unfair.
But in any case, because there's no information, it's very, very bizarre. So at one point, we're at one of the dinners, and the U.S. government is continuing to complain about our trip, and essentially the Secretary of State of their country mentions this, and I said, you must have the internet. Because they know more stuff than we do. It's a very, very bizarre place. The thing that was most disturbing was that in all of the places I've been, in East Germany, and I was in Russia as it fell, and so forth, under Yeltsin, when you would talk to the people, you would get a sense of doubt. They kind of knew that they were in an irrational system that made no sense, and the people were jokers and so forth. Here, I had no sense of that. It's one of those things where if 22 million people can be that sheepish or that frightened. And I think until that problem is solved, we're not going to make any progress with North Korea. My solution is to get them connected to the internet, and that will increase doubt, give them a notion that maybe famine is not the perpetual state of human beings, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and people are always asking us what North Korea is like just because very few people go there. We find that in a big crowd like this, the best way to illustrate it is to ask you all a question, which is, how many of you, by show of hands, have either been to a Broadway play or seen the movie The Truman Show? So that combination is North Korea, quite literally. For the population, it's The Truman Show. For foreigners, Pyongyang is a Broadway play that they put on when you're in town. So you go into the subway thinking you'll meet real North Koreans as commuters.
Look, this was my idea. My idea was, we've got these 2 minders, right? How do we escape the minders? Let's get on the subway, right? That's how you would talk to the citizens.
And they literally just go back and forth between 2 stops. They work for the government. So once you're gone, they stop commuting back and forth. We went to a university that had students. There were about 1,000 of them in front of. Can you tell your Java story? Because it really illustrates.
It was just really weird. Jared and I are sitting there, and they take us to show their programming skills. And there's a programmer who's programming in Java, which is something I know a lot about. And so any Java programmer, you can go and ask them roughly, what are you working on? So I go up to this young man who's obviously a programmer, and I ask him, and he says, it's English. So I ask him again, and he says, it's English. And then I realize that all he's doing is moving the code up repetitively up and down. So I went over to Governor Richardson. I said, the entire setup is entirely a fiction. Every single thing you're seeing here is fake. So what happened, of course, my daughter, who's clever, we all leave, and then as we leave, she fakes that she's left her scarf inside. And so she turns back and says, I've left my scarf inside. And the minder says, not possible, because they'd already disassembled the set.
And probably the most shocking of all stories, we went to go see the mausoleum where you have the embalmed bodies of the great leader and eternal president for life, Kim Il-sung, and the dear leader, comrade Kim Jong-il. And each of them have their separate trophy rooms. And their trophy rooms consist of honorary doctorates and medals from your long list of problematic countries.
Jared says each of these countries is the worst country in the world at a particular point in history.
It's like Equatorial Guinea, Central African Republic, some real winners. And really some bad dictators in these places. But there's each of them in their respective trophy cases has the same gigantic display with an honorary doctorate from an American university. And it's called Kensington University. And because we had no ability to fact-check anything or use the internet or search anything...
Anyone here been to Kensington University or been a graduate of Kensington University?
Okay, it's good that nobody raised their hands because it means you're all truthful, or you're not going to end up in prison. So you'll see where I'm going. So we didn't want to be intellectually snobby and say we've never heard of that, and so we took their word for it. So when we left North Korea and got to China, which is a bastion of democracy...
So literally, as we land in Beijing, we get our devices, and the first query is Kensington University.
Because, of course, we became obsessed with not being able to search things. So we found out that it was a money laundering scheme run by a former law partner in Texas who was selling honorary doctorates to a made-up university to dictators that essentially ruled over populations that couldn't check things. The guy was such a moron that he fled to Hawaii thinking it was another country, where eventually the FBI picked him up. Now, of course, because there's no internet access in North Korea, they presumably know this and don't care.
So you've talked about the fact that
we can go on about North Korea. It is truly a bizarre place.
Go ahead.
No. I mean, the point is, the poor American, government, right? You've got and they call him the kid, right? You've got the crazy kid with his finger on the nuclear button. Mm-hmm. And you can't tell whether he's joking or not, right? Because the guy is crazy enough, you cannot tell, right? So the correct behavior is to assume the worst. But it's probably unlikely that it's worse, because they do have some notion that they want to stay alive.
One hopes. So you've talked about how technology can foment revolution. What about the use of technology by government to suppress? Not the turning off of individuals' technology, but have you seen the kind of the reverse of this, where it clearly can be used for dictatorial purposes to suppress a population?
To some degree, China is attempting to guide information through filtering. And so they have thousands and thousands. The estimate is 30,000 people who edit the online social blogs to make sure that information that the government does not want discussed in the country is not discussed. So that's a simple example. You could imagine, we've not seen this yet, but you could imagine more aggressive governments saying mobile phones are fine, but we're going to bug each and every one of them. And since the technology has to know roughly where it is, that gives a tracking device. So you can imagine an evil combination of face recognition and mobile phone tracking and the cross-correlation of that data so that you would literally know exactly where every citizen was.
And do you feel, I know that when I traveled to the United Arab Emirates, I was informed essentially that when you turn on your cell phone, software is going to track pretty much everything you're doing on the cell phone for the time that you're in UAE, maybe beyond.
But remember that that's true in the United States to the degree that the E911 service reports exactly where you are. Everyone here has a cell phone. Everyone here in this breakfast cell phone is on. The phone company knows where you are. It's just true because of E911 services. So these occur naturally. The question is not, is it technically possible? The question is it possible to misuse that information? Thank goodness in our country that location information is not used against you. But otherwise, people here would, as a protocol, as a social value, you turn off your phone whenever you were in a private meeting.
And so how do individuals protect themselves?
Well, the first thing is you want to work in a country work and live in a country that has rule of law. So that's kind of the first and most obvious thing. And I think what I was surprised by when we were in Myanmar, Burma, the generals were running the country, they didn't really have an independent judiciary. So what I've learned is the first time you show up in a country, ask them, how independent is your judiciary? Because if you don't have an independent judiciary, I think all bets are off. But sort of the definition of an autocracy is the autocrat can do whatever they want without regard to the law. Given that, and given that the laws are somehow constructed for the betterment, then you're probably going to be okay, because there'll be enough checks and balances in it. In the case of, there's no question that there's a couple of things you should do. You need to make sure that you have passwords that are not guessable and are not common across your things. You need to make sure you don't download malware, right, which is another way in which key logging and other software gets on your computer. Everybody here works in companies. How do you know the Chinese are not wandering around your company right now in your internal internet? You don't. We were surprised to find that they were inside of Google, and we're pretty proud of ourselves. We've since strengthened our defenses a great deal, but there's every reason to think that the Chinese are wandering through your networks, at least at the moment, just maybe having a little fun. And then the third thing that you can do is use the Chrome browser, right, which is the Google browser, which is free, which is by far the most secure of them.
And so do you find, it's clear that there is a constant sort of cyber attack that is going on against the United States. Much of it appears to be coming from the East. So it seems to me, I have a vision, maybe you can describe better, I have a vision of boiler rooms full of hundreds of people who are working for the Chinese government whose job it is essentially to do what you described, which is wander through all of our networks, and particularly through our defense networks in the United States. I mean, is that a fair vision? What does it really look like?
There's a larger challenge that we're going to face in the future with regards to how states conduct their foreign policy, which gets at your question. We argue in the book that in the future every state will have two foreign policies, one for the physical world and one for cyberspace. And the U.S. and China is an illustrative example of this. It's a complex relationship in the physical world, but by all accounts, we're allies. In cyberspace, the relationship looks as adversarial as that between the U.S. and Iran. The question that one has to ask and that we pose in the book is, at what point does an attack from China in cyberspace become so serious and so severe and inflict such harsh consequences that it requires a physical world response? So we treat these two domains as separate, but eventually they become intertwined. Eric likes to talk about a Dr. Strangelove scenario where,
Look, at least this audience will know what Dr. Strangelove is.
Well, you had to teach me.
Jared,
Why don't you tell the Dr. Strangelove scenario then?
This is a generational problem between the two of us. So here we are, and you're the President of the United States, and there's been an attack. Let's imagine a terrible situation where you've got some rogue general in charge of cyber command in some country decides to unleash a virus in the United States, which morphs into something which actually affects something real, like the water system or something. And there's a real effective attack on America through this mechanism. So, and everyone assumes it's the Chinese. And so the premier of China calls up the President of the United States and says, Mr. President, it really wasn't us this time, and this time I'm telling you the truth. So imagine how hard it is, because you have some real damage in the country. You have the problem of attribution, right? Because of the way the internet works, you can't be sure who fired the equivalent of the missile, right? It's a very serious problem. People in our government are spending a fair amount of time thinking about what should our doctrine, how should we approach this?
Another example that illustrates this from a non-state actor perspective, there's a guy in Saudi Arabia who goes by the name OX Omar. And he allegedly stole 400,000 Israeli credit cards and declared a financial jihad against Israel, where he said he was going to spend them into destruction by essentially committing fraud with their credit cards. He did an interview over Skype. He sort of claimed responsibility. Given the inability to attribute these attacks and the stealing of these credit cards, how do you know if this individual is really the person doing this? How do you know if OX Omar is one person in Saudi Arabia or 100 people scattered throughout the world? And so we think it's hard to do counterterrorism today. In the future, when attribution is so difficult, and one person can in fact be hundreds of people, or hundreds of people can look like one person, it becomes much more difficult to figure out who we're supposed to respond against.
I think many of us feel a bit maybe protected from technological, revolution taking place, the literal, changing of technology and improvement, partly because I think many of us assume that the technology that gets developed will be developed here. If it gets developed elsewhere...
How about in China?
In China, for example.
Well,
how do we prevent
No, but here's an example. One of the top and a very good provider of networking equipment is Huawei. Huawei is a Chinese company run by an ex-Chinese military general. What are the odds that that's used as a vector for Chinese military or nationalistic outcomes? You choose. There are parts of our country that are banning this because they can't prove that this stuff is clear.
So how do we protect our technological edge, and how do we protect against technology from elsewhere essentially infiltrating?
The technological edge is easy. Let's let foreigners that we teach in our universities stay in the country to form companies after we've taught them with PhDs. In the list of stupid policies in America, of which there's a long list, this is literally the stupidest. Because these foreign students who we have trained in America with their PhDs in computer science and physics and math will go outside the country, will create companies. Those companies will become competitors. I'm happy to compete with American firms. I'd rather have the competition be here in America where the laws are all coherent. Right? Imagine now you kick all these really smart Chinese people back into China. Right? Now you're going to compete with them and they get to play by Chinese rules? This is terrible. Anyway, sorry.
No.
One of the other ways that we can maintain our edge...
I liked your rant, by the way, so I appreciate it.
It was a good
I
rant.
can go on.
One of the ways that we can maintain our edge internationally is to do everything we can to prevent the balkanization of the internet or the transformation of the internet into something that becomes more conducive to surveillance as opposed to openness and free. And there's only so many companies in so many countries that have the ability to build out the technological infrastructure. Huawei is certainly one of them. And most of the world's technological infrastructure has not yet been built. So Eric and I argue in the book that, in essence, there's going to be a cyber Cold War that's going to emerge between countries with different value systems who have different companies with different value systems who are competing to build out that infrastructure. If all of Africa gets built out with Huawei, then the dictatorships of today will be the cyber dictatorships of tomorrow.
But let me net it out. I think the answer to almost all of these questions is greater American economic and business strength. If America were growing at 8% a year instead of 2 or 1.8%, by the way, China's growth rate has slowed, economists believe, to 7.8%. Growth solves a lot of problems. And if we could figure out a way in our country to grow at 3% or 4%, that expansion, right, and I mean real growth. I don't mean fake growth that's funded by the Fed of fake money and stuff like this. It's real money if you take it, but you get the idea. It would create the jobs, it would create the technology, and so forth. There are reasons to think that we would win such a battle. We have far, far better research universities. 18 of the top research universities in the world are in the United States. The quality of the graduates that we're producing, both here in Chicago and all around the country, are the best in the world. Right? That's why you see so much innovation here. We have the economic engine that needs more help. Right? And the way you help it, by the way, is you get out of its way. Right? You allow it to hire the right people, you encourage exports, and all the kinds of things that I assume that the Economic Club represents.
Terrific. In a moment, I'm going to turn to the questions from our audience, which will appear on this monitor that I get to read from. But whoever's in charge of the monitor, if you'd flip to the next questions, because I already asked that one. So I have one of my own questions, and then we'll go to the monitor and to the questions from the audience. The most important question as I was on my way here this morning is, when will Google start driving my car for me?
Years, not decades. So we have this amazing technology. A serious point to start with. There are roughly 30,000 citizens who are killed on American highways every year. That number, by the way, is the lowest it's been in history on a per miles driven basis. So that's wonderful, except if you're one of the family members of the 30,000 people that have been lost through this. If you think about it for a while, you would conclude that the correct strategy is to have waited 100 years to have a self-driving car, because a car should be able to drive you much better than you can drive it. After all, cars have continuous vision. They have better vision than humans. They don't get drunk, right? They don't get tired. They can drive all night, that kind of stuff. So we're very, very close to this. The current problem is that we can recognize red lights, and we can recognize and we have this laser that looks exactly where you're going, and we're having a little trouble when the policeman runs over in front of you and goes like this. Of course, the car goes right over the policeman. And so we're working on policeman hand signal recommendation.
Do we get to sue Google when that happens?
Let's just say this is not going to happen.
Okay.
We've had a couple hundred, 250,000 accident-free miles, and I think for most people that's a pretty amazing accomplishment.
So it's through Google, and it's through Google, I think, that many people simply access the internet, whether it's over Chrome or doing a Google search on some other browser. And so, big question is, there are so many areas that Google has moved into from just being a search engine company as a result of being that on-ramp for many people. So will Google become the bank for most people? And what areas can Google move into that it isn't yet in, other than driving our cars?
We want to be a core component of the digital age as a company. And so Google will be more and more involved in sort of your daily life in a good way. The parts of a Google infrastructure, the back end, the cloud computing, all this kind of stuff. And we're very excited about that. I think it's hard to predict. The information, in particular search, morphs over time. The real problem with search is you have to type. Wouldn't it be nice if it sort of understood at some level what question you should have been asking? How close are we to be able to predict what you should have asked but you didn't? Well, for example, we have a product called Google Now, which attempts to sort of answer interesting questions. Like, it starts by trying to figure out what is your home and where does your work. And then on its own, it figures out how long it takes you to go from home and work, and then it tells you that you're late. And it works pretty well. So that's a constrained example of artificial intelligence. And our technology is getting better and better in that. In the book, we talk about a scenario, and we've talked mostly about the developing world here, but here's an example. You get up in the morning, and you have this big white screen, and you wake up, and you say to the screen, and of course it's all voice recognition, you say, do I have to get up? And the screen says, no, go back to sleep. Because it's calculated all the things that are going to happen today, and it knows, for example, that you're going to be on a flight at 2. It knows that you're late, but it also knows that the airplane's going to be late, and it knows the traffic's not going to be bad. So go back to sleep, Eric. Or it says, get up, you're late, your boss is about to fire you. Right?
So doesn't this mean, though, in order to sort of be really useful for everybody, I think we're all finding that we've had to provide information. Somebody has to know something about us as we go on the internet in order to give us useful information. So does that mean anonymity is dead?
In the Google context, we'll always allow anonymous usage to precisely address that. There are plenty of reasons why people want anonymity. The general question of anonymity is much, much more complicated. We wrote in the book that what Jared calls data permanence, or what I sort of reduce as there's no delete button on the internet, is a real change in the way the internet works.
Yeah, and I would imagine there's a lot of parents in the room. One of the arguments that we've become increasingly passionate about since being on the book tour, and which we only touch on a little bit in the book, is ultimately the best way to safeguard the next generation against the challenges of data permanence, privacy, and security. It's going to boil down to what parents do. And so we argue that parents, as their kids come online faster and younger than any other time in history, will quite literally have to talk to their children about data permanence years before they have the sex talk. It will become relevant years before talking about the birds and the bees. And this is true, by the way, not just in the United States. In Saudi Arabia, they're not likely to have the sex talk, but they are likely to have a talk with their daughter about the sort of peculiar and unfair laws that exist in Saudi Arabia and the implications for what a female who posts something online when she's 10 years old might experience when she's, say, a teenager. So a 10-year-old in Saudi Arabia can do or say something online that results in a permanent digital scarlet letter, and a mother or a father needs to talk to his or her daughter about that very early before it's even relevant to the sort of physical maturation process.
And Jared makes the argument that the physical maturity of sort of children will always lag the input and the interaction that they can have in this new empowered world. This is actually a real issue for parents, and people are going to have to figure out how to deal with this.
Do you have the manual for this? I have a 10-year-old daughter.
Well, in fact, we were thinking about trying to write what are the sort of instructions for parenting in this new world? And I think a simple one to start with is have your kid's password. Let's start there.
Well, this must have been about a week ago, we were talking about this in New York, and a mother of 2 teenage kids came up to me and said, I completely buy the argument, but what does the conversation sound like? And I had no idea, and I told her that's
because you don't have kids, Jared.
Well, I know, but I was a kid not too long ago.
It's not the same.
But what you realize, there is no perfect answer to what this conversation sounds like. So one of the other things that we've become really passionate about is how do we spark a global conversation among parents around what works and what doesn't work around talking to your kids about
we're
data
actually
permanence.
considering having a national program and movement to prevent.
So Eric keeps teasing me because I'm very upset that parents keep putting their sonograms online. I believe that
before the kid's
born. So people keep saying, people keep making the incorrect argument that your identity begins at birth, and we keep making the argument your identity begins at -6 months or whenever a sonogram is available.
God, Jared, now, do you think there's a difference between T-1 week and T+1 week in terms of permission from the unborn?
Well, presumably after a child's born, it can give a subtle wink or smirk or burp that offers
You've clearly
consent.
not had children. In any case, the serious point about this is that the day you post the sonogram of your child is the day you identify his or her digital identity, because the sonogram is unique. So at that point, the game is on. And for the rest of their lives, people will be talking about them, their digital identity will be formed, and they'll have less and less control over that identity as they age, as people describe them. When they start at birth, they have 100% control over their identity because they just got born.
And one of the other things we say about parents in the book is you have 2 types of parents, some that are very type A and want their kids to have an extra edge, and they'll give their children names that are as unique as possible so as to enhance discoverability online.
So basically give them a unique name so they come out first in the Google search results.
And then you'll have some that will give their kids very ordinary names because they want them to be as sort of undiscoverable as possible. God forbid they do something really bad.
I think those are called helicopter parents and normal parents, right?
Well, this is all true. My daughter's name is Teddy482, so it seems like the advent of blogging and now tweeting and has really brought everybody into the business of providing news to the rest of the world. And so what does that do to all the traditional media, do you think? We've seen a little bit of the effect on newspapers or in the world of newspapers, but it seems like it's all going to implode and get recreated in some way. What do you think that looks like?
Well, so I think context matters. Let me actually start with, so 57% of the world's population lives under some kind of an autocratic regime. In those environments where the media is all state-run media, the fact that it's collapsing in the face of microblogs is a good thing. So in the case of China, about a year and a half ago, there was a high-speed train crash. And the government tried to bury the train to hide it and say it didn't happen. And Weibos, which are the equivalent of Twitter in China, people were posting pictures of it, and ultimately the Chinese government decided that they had to admit that this happened, and they decided to sentence the transportation minister to death, I think, actually. In the U.S. and more democratic societies, what you're going to see is the mainstream media reporting less and validating more. So there's going to be a huge verification role and a huge analysis role that the mainstream media will play, but they're never going to be the first ones to capture the content because you can't compete with people who are right there with a mobile device. But ultimately, the people who are capturing the content on the ground, it doesn't become real, in essence, until the mainstream media retweets it or posts it or shows it.
How should schools treat technology? What I mean is, I think we've all, over the last 20 years, began this effort to have a computer in each classroom, one computer, and then there was, now it's, put a tablet or something in the hands of every student. What's the logical, forward-looking view of, what should a school classroom look like?
I'm happy to have the teaching establishment try to figure out the best way to use these tools. I don't think computer scientists necessarily know how to be the best teachers, subject to testing the outcomes. The problem I see with education as a broad statement is that although they teach A/B statistical tests, they don't apply them to themselves. So you have all of these various educational theories about great outcomes, and yet you don't measure the outcomes and prove it back. I'm on the board of something called the Khan Academy, and if you've not heard about it, your teenager probably has, or their friends have. And it's a model where the education occurs by videos, and the thesis is that you would watch the videos at night at home, and during the day, instead of having a lecture, you'd have sort of problem solving in groups. And it appears to have statistically valid improvements in science and math across high schools, both of moderate to wealthy countries, groups of maybe 10%, and in remedial areas, sort of particularly the poor and various other sort of troubled areas, of up to a factor of 10. So my argument about the internet is that we should run every conceivable experiment in education, and we should measure it. And let's let the teaching establishment then judge and then modify itself based on the real data that we can now measure with the internet. How the devices work, most kids are, the kid is going to be in a schoolroom with one old PC, and at home they've got a game console, which is the primary way in which people use computers if they're kids, and at least their parents are probably going to have mobile phones. So again, it's probably the case that the schools will continue to be behind in infrastructure, which may be okay, right? Because the families will have enough connectivity, even in poor areas.
And speak a little bit to the effect on healthcare. You talked about education. Do you have a view of what healthcare will look like kind of going forward?
Well, there's a lot of people who, under the Bush administration, the government worked very hard to create an interoperable framework of health information. And that information framework now allows these very large health databases to cross-connect. This ultimately allows for essentially information about you to be stored not in your health provider but in the cloud. And so, you have a problem, you can go to the healthcare provider, they can see your history and so forth. This all makes perfect sense. And all of that's happening. So, good for all the people working on that. The next advent of this is going to be personal diagnostics that are connected to your phone. Here's an example. You take a pill, and the pill goes into your stomach, and it Wi-Fi's out what's going on inside your body. And you go, ooh, is that going to happen? It's already been approved by the FDA. Transdermal patches, which sit on the top of your skin, they use the galvanic skin resistance as a power source. And again, they Wi-Fi out what's going on in your blood system, because they can actually, there's a way to test that. And they Wi-Fi it to your phone. The phone then calls the doctor, and then the doctor decides whether to call you back and tell you to come to the hospital. So this notion of personalized medicine that's driven by these personal devices is probably transformative for the next generation. It's literally probably the primary way where most people will get their immediate medical needs taken care of.
Are software patents helping or hurting in the development of new technology?
Google has been sued to death over this kind of stuff. Any company that has a lot of cash gets sued to death over software patents. And the reason is that in roughly the 90s, sort of any software claim was patented. And so we've worked hard to get that fixed. We tend to win all of the patent suits, so we're okay because many of the inventors of prior art are in the company. And I have suggested, for example, that the way the patent office should work is that you should publish a patent and you say, can anyone find prior art? This was suggested people loved my idea, except they said it's illegal because the whole theory of a patent is that it's secret until it's finally granted. And so we've got to sort out the fact that we've got overlapping patents. One obvious way to do it would be just to crowdsource or ask everyone to see if they can invalidate it, and if there's because the patent office itself is overwhelmed.
Can you talk about, Jared, there's been as next generation leaders have entered government, and you clearly have, you've spent several years at the State Department under two Secretaries of State. How do you see the way the government is sort of viewing the world, and with the influx of young, newer, more technology savvy people entering the bureaucracy of government?
Well, I think it's changing fast, and I should say, I actually, people are very disparaging about government. I had a phenomenal experience during my 4 years in the public sector, and felt empowered, and felt I was able to have some kind of an impact. And so I tell people to go into public service. The problem that I find with my generation is I think my generation is incredibly altruistic. I think my generation is incredibly connected, and I think my generation is incredibly entrepreneurial. I think my generation doesn't want to serve in the public sector. And so I think there's a crisis here, and I would argue...
And why?
I think part of it is my generation, I would say most of it is my generation has a view of not being able to get anything done in government, that government's broken. So I don't think this is like the 60s where a lot of it was driven by opposition to government policies. Here I think it's just sort of opposition to how government's organized, and people just have this incredibly bureaucratic view, which in large part is true. And so I've been on this sort of kick lately to try to figure out how do you get computer scientists to want to serve in the public sector? How do you get people to, yes, they want to go into startups, yes, they wanted to go into business, but how do you get them to get a taste of the public sector early on? I argue to our generation that our comparative advantage is we're the first ones that have been socialized and brought up with high prevalence of technology. And where I've seen young people have an extra edge in government is when they recognize that comparative advantage. What I always say to people is unless you work for, say, the two people sitting to my left, you're likely as a young person to know more about technology than your boss. So use that to your advantage, whether you're in government, whether you go into the medical profession, whether you go into whatever profession you're in, teach everybody above you about technology and what it can do, because it's relevant to everything. So I don't have a perfect solution for how to get my generation to want to serve in the public sector other than to get out there and evangelize about it. But it's certainly a problem. And if we don't get more of them serving in the public sector, we're going to end up with subpar leadership.
So innovation in government, frankly, is probably what's needed. And I think about what Google does with its employees, allowing them to take time away from what is their daily focus to imagine, right? And
so I could imagine the headline of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Sun-Times: employees of XYZ department encouraged to take 20% of their time to do whatever they want. Right? Can you imagine? Our government would not be able to do that. So for whatever reason, America has organized its government in such a way that innovation and risk-taking is not possible. The incentives aren't there. If you make any mistake at all, you get crucified. The best strategy for a government bureaucrat is to do exactly nothing. Because if you do something, there's a risk of failure. And you keep your job unless you fail.
So does that would naturally lead one to believe that less government would mean more innovation, that the ideas for better government come from outside government, not in?
Well, the fact of the matter is that the government is not the innovator, and the unique combination of research, business, and so forth in our country are moving at this phenomenal global pace. And so this gap is getting wider, right? And we have to address it as a country. You have leaders who come in, right, who are very committed, who feel very strongly about it, and they get sort of whittled down. So what happens is, you're a leader, you think you're the secretary of XYZ, and you say, okay, I want to hire some people. Okay, well, they have to spend 2 years being confirmed, and you're only there for 4. So you don't have any staff. And the holdover staff is the previous people. Unless you didn't like them, you can't really fire them because you have to have staff. So then you say, okay, I have a budget of God knows how many millions of dollars, and I'd like to sort of spend some money. Can't do that either because your budgets are all completely determined by the Congress. And furthermore, there are laws, so you can't violate the laws. And then anything you do is subject to increased ridicule and possible criminal penalties by the other side. So you wonder why, Jared, people don't want to work in government.
Well, so that's incredibly depressing. But
this can be fixed if we talk.
Okay, well, tell us.
No, it takes a conscious decision to empower people and judge them against outcomes, right? It's very simple for a business audience to understand. We spend gazillions of dollars in our government for things where we don't manage the outcomes. I serve on the President's Science Advisory things. We meet with all these people. These are the nicest people in the world, and I'll never forget. This nice lady had done a survey of a particular kind of healthcare measuring system, and she'd produced a nice report. And so she handed this nice plastic report out, which I read, which was quite interesting. And I said, how many people have read it? Don't know. Is it online? Not allowed to. How many people got it? You got it. So if you define your market of ideas as 20 people or 30 people, and you define that as success, and she was obviously proud of her achievement, that's where we've ended up. I mean, so if you imagine government run is based on outcomes, like we're going to do whatever it takes to improve, give you an example. We're going to do whatever it takes to improve the analytical capability of our students in this country. There's a gap of analytic performance. Analytic means math, science, economics, whatever, against the Asians, right? And the Asians are going to clean our clock at the rate things are going because there's more of them and they're better organized in terms of innovation and business over the next 50 years. So I would argue this is a national crisis, right? We need to address it. There's a few other national crises too, but let's focus on this one. So how would you address it? You'd say something to the effect of, we're going to increase the percentage of analytics achievement over a period of time by this, and we're going to do whatever it takes. We're going to hire more teachers. We're going to spend, whatever the mechanism are, and we're going to measure the outcomes. Right? It doesn't happen in America. And it doesn't happen because of the way our system works. And until we get that fixed, we're going to have the problem.
Both of you have had very high-level relationships in government, have been engaged at high level. So tell us what you see that you're hopeful about that's going on in government today.
I come from the foreign policy world, so I guess I'll restrict my commentary to that since it's where my frame of reference is. One of the most positive trends that I've seen, at least on the foreign policy side, is a recognition on the part of the State Department and other arms of government that perhaps one of the best exports of American values is American technology companies. Think about, they embrace diversity. Instead of going out and talking about democracy, they promote things like search and, organizing online and social networking, et cetera, all the things that are deeply embedded in democratic values. And what I've seen the State Department start to do over time is essentially look at companies that just by virtue of what they're doing for profit or for mission are helping advance America's interests around the world and finding ways to work together. And there's this saying that I've sort of developed in response to this, which is, in the future, statecraft will be as much about building connections as it is doing negotiations. And what I mean by that is I can even look at a situation where Eric and I met. Eric and I met at a time where Google was using Street View to start putting museums online. And we said, well, 60% of the artifacts that were looted from the Iraqi museum have been returned, but it's in the red zone, so nobody visits it. Eric said, okay, we'll just Street View the Iraqi museum and put it online so everybody can enjoy it. Imagine trying to get that done with government resources, with government employees. You would never be able to achieve it. And so what the State Department and other arms of government are recognizing is what they can't do themselves, they have a willing and able private sector who is increasingly an ally, not an adversary.
The government has adopted a lot of the tools that we're talking about now. It's taken a long time because the government is slow to adopt new things, certainly compared to the rest of the world and consumers and so forth. But you're beginning to see, especially with younger staffers, a real understanding of the possibilities of this technology. I'd like to see our government move to a model where you measure outcomes. Right? It's relatively straightforward. And by the way, I'm not arguing which outcomes. I just want to know, you can decide what outcomes you want, and then let's track and see. It would make the government so much more efficient. And the government spends lots and lots of money, right, on stuff. One of the good things that's happened recently is that we're beginning to spend more money in basic research, another thing which is a keystone of our continued leadership. I am today at this stage because the National Science Foundation funded early research that I was part of, 50 years ago. It's really important.
Will we be able to vote online at any point?
The core problem with voting is the question of voter fraud. And my guess is that the online voting would probably be more accurate than the voting we do now, where you don't even have to provide an ID. But it's so amenable to challenge that I suspect it will be a long time. Too many people would say, how do I know that that's an official result?
One of the things you're more likely to see in the short term is in environments where the government is autocratic or elections are neither free nor fair, you might be able, when entire populations are connected, to see them running parallel elections. So the Iranians are going to the polls next month on June 13th. in a future presidential election, you could imagine this whole parallel online election being run that doesn't disqualify candidates through the Guardian Council, that essentially will serve as a comparison between a rigged election and what a free and fair election would look like.
In many countries, this is very serious. In Zimbabwe, they had a recent election which Mugabe allegedly won. And what happened was they'd organized people in each of the polling districts, which were in rural areas, that they would do a local count, and then they would send the ballots on to the larger town. And so the new idea was that people in the local thing would SMS, which is everyone's phones can do, the ballot, which they would put on the wall, right, so everybody could see it. And shockingly, the ballots, by the time they arrived, did not agree with the counts, the sum of the counts from all the polling places.
Sounds like Chicago.
So there's an example where the use of technology can really make a difference. Right, this dictator who's been there for 25 or 30 years, maybe
He's
longer.
92 years old.
Yeah, who had they finally discovered how he'd rigged the elections. This stuff matters a lot.
And of course, Iceland recently crowdsourced their constitution, not an election, but certainly.
There's only 300,000 Icelandics, and they all have 3 names.
But it actually didn't go very well. But it was still interesting.
Then why are
that
you
they tried.
telling them this?
Because other countries will try to do it better.
So I can't let this opportunity go by without asking about Google Glass. And I mean, are we all going to walk around like the Borg and be sort of pushing at our the eyepiece that we're looking through? What is that?
You'll be winking at it.
Yeah, fair enough. So what does that near future look like when everybody's got Google Glass?
Well, Google Glass, only about 2,000 people have them, so they're quite rare. And we gave them to developers to see what kind of applications they would develop. We're well aware of the issues of privacy and other kinds of concerns, but no such device has ever existed. The people who have used them are fanatic about them because it changes your sort of awareness of life. You could basically ask it questions. You say, "Okay, Glass," and it says, "Hello, Eric," and you can talk to it. It talks back to you through an earpiece, and you have this little monitor here which keeps you updated on all sorts of things. So my assumption is that over the next year or so, we'll see a new generation of applications that will do very interesting, very, very powerful things with this. And whether these are work-related monitoring things or other human assistance, and we'll come up with various solutions for the privacy issues.
I have this vision that it'll have a facial recognition capability, and when I've forgotten somebody's name, it'll come up on the screen.
That's known as augmented reality, and it turns out it's a clever idea. It's probably legal in the United States and probably illegal in Europe because there are European laws about the use of commercial biometric databases in order to do name identification. So again, that's why we're being very, very careful about this. Strikes me as quite helpful, right? That this thing would sort of say the name of people because you forget their names. Right?
Indeed. But no one will forget either of your names, Jared and Eric.
Right.
Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you very much.
Well done. It's very good, Jared. Good. Thank you. Excellent job.
Eric, Jared, and JB, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning. Excellent. This meeting is adjourned.